The story begins on Earth, now a thriving colony of the Valroth Empire, an alien race that spans multiple galaxies. Despite their advanced technology and overwhelming power, the Valroth have long treated humanity as little more than a resource to exploit. The Earth is a shadow of its former self, with its leaders forced into servitude by the Valroth. However, pockets of resistance exist. A few brave men and women, both within the human colonies and hidden within the heart of the Valroth Empire, have begun to whisper of rebellion. Captain Elias Grant stood at the edge of the ruins, watching as the Valroth patrols marched through the desolate streets of New York. Once a city of bustling life and vibrant culture, it was now a ghost town under the Empire's control. Earth cities had fallen silent, the proud hum of humanity's technological prowess replaced by the cold, mechanical sounds of alien dominance. The Valroth Empire, with its massive fleet and advanced weaponry, had enslaved Earth and its people. A once proud planet was now a mere colony, used as a source of labor and resources. The leaders of Earth had been replaced by puppet rulers, and dissent was punishable by death. The Valroth had claimed victory in their conquest of Earth, and most humans had accepted their fate, resigned to the oppression they now faced. But not all had bowed to their new alien masters. In the shadows of the capital's destroyed skyline, a small group of rebels gathered. They were part of an underground movement that had been secretly fighting back for years. Among them was Elias, a man who had once led Earth's military forces before the Empire's brutal occupation. Now, he was the leader of the resistance, though the word leader felt too grand for the ragtag group of misfits and outcasts that followed him. "We have to do something," Elias muttered to his second-in-command, Lila Pierce, a former intelligence officer who had narrowly escaped a Valroth raid. "We can't just sit here and watch Earth die." Lila nodded, her face set in grim determination. "The Valroth think we're broken. But I've seen the reports. There's unrest in the colonies. We can still make them afraid." Elias turned away from the window, his eyes scanning the faces of his crew. Each one had a story, a reason to fight, but the weight of their cause was heavy. For years, they had worked in secret, collecting intel, sabotaging supply lines, and training in the shadows. The odds were overwhelming. They were nothing more than a few dozen soldiers against an entire galactic empire. Yet something had changed. The people of Earth, once resigned to their fate, had begun to whisper of rebellion. The small acts of defiance, like the recent sabotage of a Valroth communications relay, had spread like wildfire. Hope, a dangerous thing in the Empire's eyes, was starting to take root. "The time has come," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with the fire of resolve. "We strike tonight." The room fell silent. Lila studied him for a moment before speaking. "You're certain? If we do this, there's no turning back." "I know," Elias replied, his gaze unwavering. "But if we don't do something now, we'll never get another chance. We'll be nothing more than slaves for the rest of our lives." As the crew prepared for the mission ahead, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this small strike, this simple act of rebellion, would be the spark that could light the fire of freedom across Earth. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could either break them or ignite a revolution. But for the first time in years, Elias felt the weight of Earth's oppression lifting, if only a little. This was just the beginning. "Let's show them who we are," Elias said, turning to his team. "Let's remind the galaxy what humanity is capable of." And with that, the rebellion began. The human resistance was small, too small to challenge the Valroth Empire head-on. But in the shadows, they had learned to make their size their strength. They operated in secret, striking swiftly and vanishing before the Valroth could retaliate. It was a strategy born of necessity, and now, it was time to act. Elias Grant stood at the helm of an old freighter, its hull patched and barely functional, a stark contrast to the sleek, imposing ships of the Valroth fleet. The plan was simple: infiltrate the Valroth-controlled city of New Olympia, destroy the communication relay that linked the Empire's fleet to its ground forces, and escape before reinforcements could be deployed. A small but critical blow to the Empire's command structure. The kind of act that would send a message: humanity was not finished. Are you sure about this? Lila Pierce asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty as she glanced out from the cockpit window. The city of New Olympia loomed in the distance, its gleaming towers of alien architecture rising into the dark sky. Elias nodded. We've got one shot at this. If we pull it off, we cripple their command for weeks. If we fail, we run. It's as simple as that. Lila's expression hardened. Then let's make sure we don't fail. The team, a mix of former soldiers, engineers, and hackers, gathered in the cramped interior of the ship, each one preparing for the task ahead. At the core of the mission was the sabotage of the Valrotha's primary communications tower, a massive structure that sat in the heart of the city. It was heavily guarded, but Elias had a plan. They would split into two teams, one to disable the security systems and clear a path to the tower, and the other to set the explosives and cover their retreat. As the ship descended into New Olympia's atmosphere, Elias felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him. This wasn't just a tactical strike, this was their declaration of war. The Valroth would have no choice but to respond with full force, and the risk of failure was high. But there was no turning back now. We're close, Elias said, scanning the readouts on the control panel. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw the defensive perimeter around the city. The Valroth had fortified every entry point, but they hadn't accounted for the Resistance's ingenuity. Elias had chosen this route specifically because it offered the best chance to infiltrate without drawing attention. As they neared the landing zone, Lila turned to him, her eyes sharp. We go in, hit them hard, and get out before they know what's happened. Elias gave her a tight smile. Exactly. Remember, no heroics. We get in, we destroy the tower, and we leave. We can't afford to get bogged down. The freighter touched down on a desolate street, far from the center of the city but close enough to be within striking distance of the tower. The team suited up, readying their weapons and equipment. Elias checked his tactical map one last time, ensuring everyone knew their role. Time to make history, Elias said, his voice low but filled with purpose. The team disembarked, moving swiftly through the darkened streets, their boots silent against the pavement. They moved in small groups, using the shadows for cover as they approached the tower. Security drones patrolled the area, scanning for any signs of movement, but the Resistance had learned to stay ahead of their enemies. A few well-placed EMP charges disabled the drones, leaving the path open. Within minutes, they reached the tower's perimeter. Elias's heart raced as he watched the glowing red lights of the Valroth security systems flicker in the distance. They had to be quick, too much time spent in the open would risk detection. Team A, you're up, Elias whispered into his comm unit. A pair of Resistance soldiers moved forward, hacking into the security system to disable the alarms and unlock the gates. As the gate slid open, Elias signaled for the second team to advance. Move, move, move. Elias shouted as he and his team sprinted toward the tower. The towering structure loomed above them, its alien architecture sleek and intimidating. They planted charges at the base, the hum of energy filling the air as they armed the explosives. As the last charge was set, the sound of approaching Valroth soldiers reached Elias's ears. They're coming, he muttered, motioning for his team to fall back. Just as they were retreating to their extraction point, the unmistakable sound of enemy reinforcements filled the air. A squadron of Valroth warriors appeared from a side street, their weapons raised, and their eyes glowing with the cold intensity of trained killers. Time to go! Elias shouted. The team fired in unison, their weapons blazing as they laid down suppressing fire to cover their retreat. The Valroth soldiers were momentarily stunned, giving the rebels enough time to slip into the shadows. The explosion was imminent, but they had to get clear. 10 seconds. Lila yelled as she sprinted toward the extraction point. The ground beneath them shook as the first charge went off. The communications tower erupted in a brilliant flash, sending a shockwave through the city that knocked the rebels off their feet. But Elias didn't look back. They had done it. The Valroth were crippled. We've done it! Lila shouted, her voice filled with exhilaration. But Elias's joy was short-lived. As they reached the extraction point, a fleet of Valroth ships appeared on the horizon. This was just the beginning, Elias said quietly, as they prepared to leave the planet behind. The war's only starting. The rebellion had struck its first blow. The Valroth had felt their power shaken. The message was clear: humanity was no longer willing to bow. They would fight, and they would win. The Valroth Empire, though momentarily stunned by the destruction of their primary communication tower, wasted little time in launching a counteroffensive. Within days of the rebel attack, the Valroth unleashed their wrath on Earth's colonies, their massive warships blocking out the stars and raining destruction down on any resistant stronghold they could find. The rebellion had struck a small but significant blow, but now the full might of the Empire was bearing down on humanity. Elias Grant sat in the command center of the rebel base, a deep frown etched across his face as he watched the incoming transmissions from the colonies. The devastation was catastrophic. Entire cities had been wiped off the map, and the human resistance was being decimated. The Empire's fleet had descended like a storm, and every attempt to retaliate had been crushed by overwhelming firepower. "We've lost contact with Sector 5, Lila reported, her voice tight with frustration. They were holding out longer than most, but the Valrotha's reinforcement fleet arrived too soon. They're gone, Elias. We can't keep up this pace." Elias leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The rebel forces were scattered, their resources dwindling, and their morale hanging by a thread. The odds were never in their favor, but after the initial victory, the resistance had hoped to keep the Valroth Empire off balance. Instead, the Empire had swiftly retaliated, bringing their full force to bear against Earth's last line of defense. "We can't afford to fall back, Lila," Elias said, his voice steady but tinged with the exhaustion of battle. "If we lose the colonies, Earth is next. We have to find a way to turn this around." "We need a miracle," Lila muttered under her breath, glancing at the digital map of the warzone. The Valroth fleet was too vast, and their technology too advanced. It seemed as though humanity had been overpowered, the resistance snuffed out before it could truly begin. A silence fell over the command center as Elias scanned the battlefield. Then, a thought struck him, an idea so audacious, so risky, it could either be the salvation of humanity or their complete annihilation. "We need to hit them where it hurts," Elias said, his eyes narrowing. "Not just the fleet, but their very foundation. The Valroth rely on their energy sources to maintain their empire. If we can cripple their energy infrastructure, we might be able to slow them down. We'll need the full support of every colony that's still fighting." Lila's gaze sharpened. "You're talking about a direct strike on their primary energy grid. That's a suicide mission. The Empire has defense systems in place that we can't even begin to breach. We're outgunned." Elias smiled grimly. "You're right. But it's the only shot we've got. If we can force the Empire to divide their forces, we might be able to create an opening for a larger offensive. A few critical strikes, and the Valroth might be forced to retreat. We hit them where they least expect it, inside their own empire." The room fell silent as the plan took shape. It was a desperate gambit, a hope that would either turn the tide of the war or bury them all beneath the weight of the Valrotha's might. But Elias wasn't one to back down from impossible odds. He had seen too much of humanity's resolve, the fire that burned deep within people's hearts when they had nothing left to lose. "We've got to do it," Elias said, his voice unwavering. "If we fail, Earth falls. If we succeed, we buy ourselves a chance to win this war. We need to strike at their energy hubs, disrupt their supply chains, and cripple their fleet. This is our chance." Lila hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Let's assemble the teams. We'll need every ship, every soldier we can muster. I'll coordinate with the other colonies." As the command center shifted into high gear, preparing for the boldest operation the rebellion had ever attempted, Elias stared out into the vastness of space. The odds were still against them, but the idea of giving up was even more unbearable. It wasn't just about Earth anymore. It was about the future of humanity. The Valroth Empire had underestimated them before, and they would do so again. The time for small acts of defiance had passed. It was time for a full-scale war. The next few days were a blur of planning, coordination, and preparation. Elias and Lila worked tirelessly, sending out messages to the various resistance groups scattered across the colonies, urging them to unite under one banner for a single, decisive strike. The plan was to divide the Valroth's attention, drawing their forces away from Earth's remaining colonies by hitting their most vulnerable targets, those critical energy hubs that powered their war machine. The operation would require the resistance to infiltrate heavily guarded Valroth systems. It was a task that would require everything they had, every ounce of skill, every drop of courage. Failure would mean the destruction of what little remained of the human rebellion. Elias knew that the fate of humanity rested on this next step. If they could disrupt the Valroth's energy grid, they could slow the Empire's march, forcing them to split their resources between defending their own infrastructure and suppressing the growing rebellion. It would be a long shot, but it was humanity's best shot. As the first wave of rebel ships prepared to launch, Elias stood before his team, his voice calm but resolute. "Remember why we're doing this," he said, locking eyes with each member of the team. "We're not just fighting for survival. We're fighting for our future, for the future of every human being who has ever lived and everyone who will come after us. We fight for Earth, we fight for the colonies, and we fight for the galaxy." The fleet launched into the vastness of space, and as the stars blurred around them, Elias could only hope that this gamble would be the turning point in their war. If the Valroth thought the rebellion was finished, they would soon learn the truth. Humanity was far from done. The mission was set in motion, and the first wave of rebel ships sped toward the Valroth Empire's energy hubs. But, as with all bold plans, the unforeseen dangers soon revealed themselves. The Valroth, with their vast empire and sophisticated intelligence network, were not as blind to the rebellion's movements as the resistance had hoped. Elias sat in the command center aboard the flagship Ares, watching as the fleet moved toward their designated targets. The ships were sleek and fast, equipped with the latest technology scavenged from Valroth remnants and human ingenuity. They were a ragtag collection, but they were determined. They had one shot at this, and Elias was resolved to see it through. "Coordinates are set," Lila's voice crackled through the comms. "We're almost at the first energy hub. Prepare for engagement." Elias nodded. "Stay sharp. The Valroth are not fools, they'll be expecting us." The fleet approached the massive energy refinery orbiting a gas giant, its glowing core a beacon in the depths of space. The structure was surrounded by automated defenses, but the plan was clear: disable the outer perimeter and make it inside before reinforcements arrived. It was the same strategy they had used against the communication tower, but this time, the stakes were higher. Suddenly, a red alert blared across the command deck. Elias' heart sank. "They've spotted us," Lila said. "Too soon. They've activated their defense grid early." Elias cursed under his breath. The Valroth had anticipated their move, and now the energy hub was on full alert. The automated turrets began firing on the incoming fleet, and massive drones appeared from the shadows of the refinery, locking onto their targets. "Shields up!" Elias barked. "Evasive maneuvers, now!" The Ares shook as laser fire ricocheted off its shields. The crew scrambled to keep the ship on course, but the Valroth were overwhelming. They had anticipated this rebellion, and they were ready. The rebels tried to push forward, but it was clear the Valroth had more firepower and better coordination. Their warships arrived in waves, hammering the human fleet from every angle. The rebels had speed and stealth on their side, but the Valroth had sheer numbers and superior weaponry. A large explosion rocked the Ares, and Elias stumbled as the ship lurched violently. His heart raced as he looked at the damage reports flooding in. "Report," he shouted, gripping the console in front of him. "We've lost 2 of our frigates," Lila's voice came through, tight with urgency. "The refinery's defenses are tougher than we thought. We can't break through like this." Elias gritted his teeth. They needed to push forward, but their current tactics were failing. We need to get in closer. If we don't hit the core of their system, this mission is over. Lila, take the helm. We're going in. Before she could respond, another explosion rocked the ship. This time, it was much closer. The lights flickered, and the engines sputtered. Starboard thrusters are offline, the chief engineer reported. We've lost control of that quadrant. Elias' mind raced. The plan was crumbling, and the resistance was at risk of losing their only opportunity to strike the Valroth where it hurt most. But even in the face of disaster, Elias refused to give up. Lila, can you get us to that refinery? Elias asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lila's hands danced over the controls. I can try, but it's going to be close. Elias could see the determination in her eyes. Do it. We make it through this, and we end this war. With a sharp turn, the Ares broke through the outer defenses, narrowly avoiding a barrage of laser fire. They were inside now, the heart of the Valrotha's energy grid. Deploy the EMPs. Elias ordered. Now. The team worked quickly, placing the electromagnetic pulse devices that would disable the Valrotha's energy infrastructure. As they prepared to set the charges, Elias looked out at the advancing Valroth forces. The tide had shifted, they were outgunned, but they had made it this far. There was no turning back. Charges set, Lila called out, her voice strained but determined. We need to get out of here, Elias. The Valroth are about to bring down everything they've got. Elias nodded, his pulse quickening. Get us out, Lila. We've done our part. Now, let's make sure they can't stop us. But just as they were about to initiate their escape, a massive shadow appeared on the horizon. A Valroth flagship, unlike anything they had seen before, loomed over them, its weapons primed. The sheer size and power of the ship dwarfed the rebel fleet. It had been waiting for them. We're not alone, Lila said grimly. That ship, it's the Varkath, the Valrotha's flagship. They've been tracking us this entire time. Elias' mind raced. The Empire had set a trap, and now the rebels were caught in its jaws. The EMPs were set, but the Valroth flagship would ensure they wouldn't escape alive. Light them up, Elias commanded, his voice cold. We're not dying here. Not today. The Ares and its fleet fired everything they had, sending wave after wave of firepower toward the massive Valroth ship. But the sheer scale of the enemy vessel was too much. The energy blasts barely made a dent in its hull. This is it, Elias muttered. They're too strong. But in the chaos, something unexpected happened. A small, agile ship, one of the rebel scouts, appeared from behind the Valroth flagship, its weapons blazing. Support is here, Lila said, a note of hope creeping into her voice. It's a diversion. The rebel scout ship's attack disrupted the Valroth flagship's targeting systems, allowing the human fleet a brief window of opportunity to break free. Elias slammed the control lever forward. We're not dying today. All ships, retreat. Now. With an explosion of speed, the rebel fleet broke through the Valroth blockade, the massive flagship unable to adjust in time. They had made it out, but the victory felt hollow. The Valroth Empire was relentless. The war was far from over. As they made their way into the safety of deep space, Elias looked at the silent, damaged fleet around him. They'll come after us, Lila said softly. They'll come harder this time. Elias stared out at the stars, the weight of their losses heavy on his shoulders. Let them. We'll keep fighting. We'll never bow. The rebellion had taken a blow, but they had delivered a crippling strike to the Valroth Empire. The battle for humanity's freedom was far from over, but as long as they were alive, they would fight. The escape from the Valroth flagship had been nothing short of miraculous, but Elias knew it was just a temporary reprieve. The Empire's response was swift, and their retaliation would be even fiercer. The rebels had succeeded in disabling the energy grid, but at great cost. Many ships had been destroyed in the attack, and several colonies had paid a heavy price for the brief victory. The Valroth, though wounded, were far from broken. They had underestimated the rebellion once, but they would not make that mistake again. As the fleet drifted through deep space, regrouping and tending to their wounds, Elias stood at the command center, his eyes fixed on the star map in front of him. The Empire's movements were predictable now. They would strike at Earth next, the heart of humanity's resistance. It was only a matter of time before the full might of the Valroth fleet descended upon the last remaining human stronghold. "We can't afford to wait for them to come to us," Lila said, breaking into Elias' thoughts. She had been at his side throughout the battle, and her voice held a weariness that mirrored his own. "The Valroth will crush Earth if we don't do something soon." Elias nodded grimly. The plan was simple in concept but impossible in execution. They had to go on the offensive, take the fight to the Valroth Empire before Earth became its next target. It was the only way to buy humanity time, to keep the Valroth distracted long enough for the rebellion to rebuild. But the odds were stacked against them. The Valroth's forces had grown stronger, and their fleets were more numerous than ever before. Earth was vulnerable, too far from the rebellion's scattered forces to call for backup, and surrounded by the Empire's most powerful warships. "What do you have in mind?" Lila asked, sensing the storm brewing in Elias' mind. Elias took a deep breath, steeling himself for what would come next. "We strike at the heart of their empire. We disrupt their command center, their leadership. If we can cripple their command infrastructure, we can force them to fall back. Without leadership, their fleets will fall into chaos. It's a gamble, but it's the only chance we've got." Lila stared at him, a flicker of doubt crossing her features before she nodded. "It's bold. It could work, or it could get us all killed." "We'll make it work," Elias replied. "I'm not about to let humanity's last hope be crushed without giving everything we've got. If we can't break the Valroth's leadership, Earth is doomed." The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. The rebel fleet was small, but their resolve was ironclad. They would be heading deep into Valroth territory, far beyond the reach of any reinforcements. The mission was dangerous, an assault on the Empire's core world, where their highest command structures were located. The heart of the Valroth Empire, a planet known as Valron Prime, was heavily fortified and defended by an armada of warships. Elias knew the odds were stacked against them, but he also knew that this was humanity's only chance at survival. The attack on Valron Prime would send a message to the Empire: humanity was not finished. The rebellion was growing stronger, and they would stop at nothing to free their people from the Valroth's iron grip. "Prepare the fleet," Elias said to Lila as the rebel forces gathered for the assault. "We hit them fast and hard. No hesitation." Lila's face was set in a grim line, but there was a fire in her eyes. "Understood. We're not backing down. Let's show the Valroth what happens when you underestimate us." As the rebel fleet set course for Valron Prime, the finality of their decision settled in. There was no turning back. The Empire would respond with everything they had, but the rebels had one thing the Valroth could never understand: the unyielding will to fight. To survive. To win. The journey through Valroth space was perilous. Every moment, Elias felt the weight of their mission. The fleet passed through a series of asteroid fields and nebulae, using the cover of space to avoid detection. The Valroth Empire's sensors were sophisticated, but the rebels had learned how to evade them, until they reached the heart of enemy space. As they neared Valron Prime, the rebel fleet began to disperse, spreading out into smaller groups to make themselves harder to target. Elias' pulse quickened as they approached the planet's orbit. The planet itself was a fortress, its skies filled with countless Valroth ships. There would be no room for error. "Report," Elias said as the fleet neared the outer edge of the planet's defense perimeter. "Multiple enemy ships detected," Lila responded, her voice tight with tension. "They're aware of our approach. We'll be engaged in less than 10 minutes. Elias stood in front of the massive viewscreen, staring out into the vast expanse of space. Valron Prime loomed before them, a world of steel and fire, bristling with weapons and defenses. This was it. The last stand. "We're going in," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "Engage the fleet. Take down their outer defenses. We make it to the surface, and we hit their command center. We end this war." The rebel fleet surged forward, diving toward the heavily defended planet. The battle was immediate and brutal. The Valroth were waiting, and they hit the rebels with everything they had. Massive warships fired on the incoming fleet, launching waves of deadly energy blasts. Smaller ships engaged in dogfights, weaving between massive explosions as they fought for dominance in the skies. The rebel ships fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Elias watched as one of their frigates was obliterated by a direct hit, its debris scattering across the battlefield. The loss was heavy, but the rebels pushed on. "We're through their outer defenses," Lila shouted. "We're almost there." Elias' heart raced as the fleet neared the planet's surface, and the final phase of the mission began. The rebel ships launched themselves downward, toward the heart of the Valroth Empire's power. "We fight for Earth," Elias muttered under his breath. "We fight for all of humanity." And with that, they descended into the inferno, the fate of the rebellion hanging in the balance. The battle raged above Valron Prime as Elias and the remaining rebel forces plunged deeper into enemy territory. The Valroth had anticipated the assault, and their counterattacks were relentless. Rebel ships were being torn apart one by one, their crews fighting to the last breath, but the sheer force of the Valroth warships was overwhelming. Each second brought them closer to their target, the heart of the Valroth Empire's command center, buried deep beneath the planet's surface. The rebellion had one objective: to cripple the Valroth leadership before the entire human race was wiped from existence. "We've lost half of the fleet," Lila's voice came through the comms, her tone grim. "We can't keep up with this pace much longer." Elias gripped the armrest of his command chair, his knuckles white. "Hold the line. We're not turning back now. We reach that command center or we die trying." As the remaining rebel ships fought to stay in the sky, Elias watched the star map flicker with information. Their entry into Valron Prime's atmosphere had gone largely unnoticed by the Valroth, until now. With the outer defenses failing, the real battle had begun. Rebel forces were now charging into the city-sized fortress that served as the Valroth leadership's headquarters. "We're within range," Lila reported. "The planetary defense grid is on high alert. Expect heavy fire once we hit their landing zone." Elias stood, his eyes locked on the tactical display, as the countdown began. The fleet's final push to disable the Valroth command center was underway, and they had to take the planet's core systems down in a single strike. The team had come up with an audacious plan: infiltrate the heavily guarded facility, plant a series of explosive charges in key locations, and escape before the Valroth could react. With the fleet battling above them, the ground assault team descended through the dark clouds and smoke of Valron Prime. Elias, Lila, and a select group of elite rebels, those who had survived the chaos of the fleet's assault, had one final objective: reach the heart of the Valroth Empire and bring it crashing down. The landing zone was a scarred, war-torn stretch of urban sprawl. The Valroth forces had fortified it to the teeth, knowing the rebellion would be coming for them. As Elias and his team disembarked, they were immediately met with gunfire. The enemy was everywhere, and the terrain was a labyrinth of destroyed buildings, alien barricades, and roving squads of Valroth soldiers. "We need to move fast," Elias barked as his team scrambled to cover behind debris. "We've got less than an hour before the fleet pulls back. Get to the command center. Plant the explosives and let's get out of here." Lila was the first to leap into action, her agility and precision unmatched as she darted through the wreckage, gunfire from the enemy splintering the ruins around her. "Follow me," she shouted, disappearing into the chaos. Elias was close behind, his mind focused on the mission. He had no illusions about their chances. The odds were slim, but the stakes were higher than ever before. They had to succeed. They had no other choice. Valron Prime was the brain of the Valroth Empire, and if they could bring it down, they could stop the entire war in its tracks. Their route was perilous, and they were forced to fight every step of the way. The Valroth were well-equipped and ruthless. However, the rebels had something the Empire could never replicate, the will to fight. As they moved through the desolate streets, the weight of their mission pushed them onward. Every door they breached, every hallway they cleared, brought them closer to the heart of the Valroth's military command. The base itself was a fortress, a massive citadel carved into the core of the planet, surrounded by layers of security and armed guards. Each floor of the building had been designed to withstand the most intense assaults. But it wasn't enough to stop humanity. Elias' heart raced as they approached the command center, a massive door sealed by a series of high-tech locks. "We're almost there," he said, voice low. "Lila, open the door." Lila quickly began hacking the complex security system, her fingers flying over the console. The sound of enemy footsteps echoed in the hallways, growing louder by the second. The clock was ticking. "Just a few more seconds," she called out, sweat dripping down her brow. The sound of enemy soldiers closing in spurred Elias into action. He signaled to his team, and they immediately spread out, weapons raised, ready for a final stand. As the door slid open with a soft hiss, the team rushed in, planting explosives along the central core of the Valroth command center. "This is it," Elias whispered, looking over the chaotic scene around them. The Valroth leadership, the high-ranking officials that had ordered the genocide of entire planets, were gathered in a large chamber, completely unaware of the rebels' intrusion. Their last moments of power were fleeting, and Elias could see the terror creeping into their eyes as they realized what was about to happen. Lila activated the detonator. "It's done," she said, voice steady. "We're clear to leave." But before they could make their escape, the base's alarms blared. The entire facility was on lockdown, and the Valroth were preparing for a counterattack. Their time had run out. "Fall back!" Elias shouted. "Everyone to the extraction point." With no time to waste, the team fought their way back through the crumbling corridors, their every step a race against the clock. The explosions that would send the Valroth Empire into chaos were only moments away. But the Valroth weren't going down without a fight. As the rebel team reached their extraction point, a massive explosion shook the building. The walls trembled, and the air was thick with dust. It was the first of many blasts. The Valroth command center was collapsing in on itself, and with it, the heart of their empire. "We're not done yet," Elias yelled, pulling his team into the escape pod. "Let's get out of here." The Valroth had been crippled, but the war wasn't over. Yet, as the pod shot into the sky, Elias felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, they had dealt the Empire a blow it couldn't recover from. But the fight was far from over. The Valroth would come for them. And the rebel forces would be ready. As the escape pod rocketed away from Valron Prime, Elias gripped the straps holding him in place, his mind spinning. The destruction they had caused, blowing apart the Valroth command center, had shaken the Empire to its core. But he knew better than to think it was over. The Valroth would regroup, retaliate, and rebuild. They would seek vengeance for this attack. The rebel fleet was scattered, fractured after the brutal assault on Valron Prime. But Elias, Lila, and the surviving crew had dealt the Empire a blow so severe that even the Valroth's vast resources might struggle to recover. The leadership had been decimated. Command structures were in disarray. For the first time in the war, Elias believed they had a chance. The escape pod jolted as it broke through Valron Prime's atmosphere, joining the remnants of the rebel fleet in space. The atmosphere inside was tense. The crew, bruised and battered, was silent. They had survived, but at great cost. "We did it," Lila said quietly, looking at Elias. Her expression was a mixture of exhaustion and cautious optimism. "The Valroth leadership is gone. We've bought Earth some time." Elias nodded, his gaze shifting toward the dark expanse of space outside the window. "Time is all we can hope for. But we've still got a long way to go. The Valroth will rebuild, but we've shown them that they can be beaten. The rebellion's true strength lay not in numbers, but in their resolve. Humanity's refusal to bow before the Valroth Empire had ignited a fire across the galaxy. Other races, oppressed by the Valroth's tyranny, were beginning to rise up as well. The rebellion had become a symbol of hope, a beacon for all who had suffered under the Empire's rule. Elias turned to the communications panel, his fingers hovering over the controls. The message he had to send was one of defiance and strength. He knew that the galaxy was watching, waiting to see if humanity's fight was truly unstoppable. "Attention all rebel forces," he began, his voice strong and unwavering. "The Valroth believed we were nothing. They thought we would kneel before their might, that they could wipe us out with ease. But we showed them the truth. We are not a race to be conquered. We are the spark that will ignite the galaxy's freedom. The fall of Valron Prime is only the beginning." He paused, letting the words sink in, knowing they would resonate across the galaxy. "To the oppressed, to those who have been silenced for too long, your time has come. The Valroth are no longer untouchable. We will rise together, and we will bring them down." A sense of unity and purpose surged through Elias as he finished his speech. He could feel it in his bones. The rebellion had turned a corner. This was no longer just about humanity's survival. This was about changing the balance of power in the galaxy. The Valroth had made a fatal mistake in underestimating them. And now, humanity had become the most dangerous force in the universe. "We've got company," Lila said, her voice cutting through the reverie. She was looking at the radar, her expression shifting to one of urgency. "Incoming ships. And they're not Valroth." Elias' pulse quickened. The rebel fleet wasn't the only one watching the destruction of the Valroth leadership. Other factions, alien species oppressed by the Empire for centuries, had begun to take notice. They had been waiting for a sign that resistance was possible, and the fall of Valron Prime was just the signal they had been waiting for. As the ships came into view, Elias saw the colors of the fleet on his screen, ships of various designs, bearing the flags of multiple races. A coalition had formed, one born from a shared desire to see the Valroth Empire burn. The rebels were no longer alone. "They're joining us," Lila said, a smile breaking through her exhausted expression. "The galaxy is uniting against the Valroth." Elias allowed himself a brief moment of relief. Their rebellion had sparked a revolution that could change everything. The Valroth had underestimated humanity's ability to inspire, to unite. In their arrogance, they had underestimated the sheer power of a determined people. For the first time in years, hope surged through Elias' heart. The fight wasn't over, but they had won a pivotal battle. The Valroth Empire was on the edge of collapse. And humanity was at the forefront of the charge that would bring about its downfall. As the rebel fleet and its newfound allies prepared to strike the final blow, Elias knew one thing for certain: humanity had refused to bow. They had defied the impossible, and in doing so, had become the most formidable force in the galaxy. And this was only the beginning. The human rebellion had begun with a single, desperate fight for survival, but it would end with the fall of an empire. The Valroth had been warned. The galaxy had been changed forever. And humanity would never again be underestimated.